Thanks. My name is Jason Colquitt, and on behalf of Global Genes and the Orphan Disease Center, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this session on data strategy for research and development. What do advocates need to know? Very hot topic these days. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Before we get kicked off, I want to go over a few brief housekeeping notes. The chat to the left of the video allows you to interact with each other and program staff, and we hope you use this opportunity to make some new connections. Please note that links and resources are not able to be shared via chat. If you would like to upload any shared resources for the community, please share those via the social wall. The questions box is located to the left of your screen. We encourage you to use the questions box to share your questions with the presenters. This is your time to find answers and insights to help you advance your work as a partner in research. Please note that the speakers will not be able to see any questions entered in the chat area rather than the official questions section. If we are not able to address all questions, we will do our best to follow up afterwards. To the right of your video, you will see captions and translations. To utilize either, please expand that session and select your language. Thank you to Horizon and Greenwich Biosciences for their support of these tools. If you have any questions about technology or program, please look at the request support button in each session or the live support chat in the bottom right corner of non-session pages. Finally, we encourage you all to participate as active listeners and take advantage of the opportunity to hear the leaders and experts speaking here and ask questions. We want to ensure that we have created a relevant and impactful program for you and greatly appreciate you sharing your time with us. Our format today is going to be right along with that adage that I just spoke to. It's going to be a free-flowing fireside chat. We're not going to use slides. So hopefully, we are asking that you guys participate. We appreciate your time today. I want to first kick it off by giving you a little bit more detail other than my name. So I'm Jason Colquitt, CEO of Across Healthcare. I actually have a rare disease, a mitochondrial rare disease myself, but I've been in the healthcare technology space for 22 years. So I know the electronic health record, electronic medical record really well. I spent 14 years of my career there and then pivoted into clinical research with real-world late-phase division of IQVIA. And now I'm at Across, where I do provide systems on top of patient advocacy groups to do natural history studies and other registry type activity. So with that, I will turn it over for brief introductions from the other panelists. So Jeff, take it away.
All right, good afternoon. First, thank you to Global Genes and everybody that had an effort involved in putting this on today. It's really spectacular, and it's an honor for me personally to be here with Jason and Becca. I come into this space from a parent and a patient-led organization perspective. My daughter, Ella, is 3, and 2 years ago, she was diagnosed with Kleefstra syndrome. And so out of that, like everything, it was we created an organization called ID10. So we created it out of a necessity. There was nothing available as far as anything in the US as far as a research organization. And so we wanted to build a community, drive research, and really figure out a way to bring a treatment to our kids. Because like 95% of the other rare diseases out there, there is nothing currently available. And so data strategy and data collection is a huge part of that. I had my head swirling for a long time about it, and have been fortunate to kind of come out on the other side. And hopefully some of the experiences I've had can be shared with you all to make your time easier. So I will turn it over to Becca.
Thanks. And I want to also thank Global Genes for organizing this great meeting and giving us the opportunity to really speak with you and to chat with you about the questions you might have on this topic. So I'm Becca Ahrens-Nicholas. I'm a physician scientist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Specifically, I'm a clinical geneticist that takes care of kids with rare diseases, mostly metabolic diseases or biochemical diseases. So I sort of work in all aspects of this field, from partnering with families through the diagnostic process and the management process, all the way to the basic science side of things, where we're trying to develop new therapies for rare diseases in my research laboratory. But relevant to what we're talking about today, I've partnered with a number of advocacy groups and family foundations to really try to explore how we can try to best understand the natural history of rare diseases and really ultra rare diseases, and in a way that's meaningful and useful, both for the families and the patients, and also for future drug development efforts. So I think it's a really important topic, and then obviously we're all excited to talk about it with you. So feel free to ask questions.
So Jeff, Becca, I know, we probably have all levels of people listening to us, those that really understand the research spectrum and what's going on and the uses of those data downstream, and those that I'm just starting a foundation, I have no idea. And I talk to both ends of those spectrum. So I guess to bring it back to the basics, I know I threw out the terms natural history study. I heard Becca, you did as well. What should an advocacy group or somebody in this space be thinking about with their data and thinking of those terms like natural history study, registries?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I think it really depends on where you are in this process and how much is known about the disease of interest, right? So if you have a brand new disorder that, for example, a new gene, and you're just starting to really understand it, you're at a very different place than a more established disorder where there's already a little bit or some known about the natural history. And so I think the answer varies a little bit about sort of where you are in this process or where the disease is in the process. And so I think we've talked about it. There's a number of ways you can sort of gauge where you are and decide what the next step is with where you need to go. And so I think the first basic step is just to know what's out there, right? So find someone, speak with people about if there's been any efforts to connect patients, to identify patients, and to collect their data. And just understanding the landscape first will let you know where you need to go. Because as a first step, you just got to find patients, right? So whether that be through a contact registry, where it's really just trying to identify patients, or other mechanisms, you first need to know where the patients are, and then you can think about what type of questions you want to ask them. So I think it really depends on surveying the landscape of your disease of interest and understanding where you're starting from, and then moving beyond that. And we can talk about those steps as we go on. I don't know, Jeff, if you wanted to add more, but.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I mean, you have to identify your patient population, who they are, where they are, and typically that can be found for our experience and so many others through a social media channel at this point. You know, there's all these private groups out there where parents are getting together and discussing these things, and that's certainly my experience for Kleefstra syndrome. But the challenge I saw with that is that the information was then housed in this Facebook group, right? And so it wasn't actually being put in the hands of folks that can translate it and utilize it to move the needle. And so once you recognize that, you know, you find your patient population, then you start developing the questions of why collect the data. Like, you have to start asking that very early on before you figure out maybe the who, what, when, and how, right? I think you got to understand why, because if you're not starting from that point, then you're going to be kind of going on a very inefficient course. And so I would encourage everybody to start with the why. What are the questions you're trying to answer? What are the pain points of the community? And making sure that the patient voice is represented first and foremost, because without the patient voice, it's kind of all for naught.
I think you guys hit it on it, but I will add this. I see lots of questions coming in, so maybe you guys can start looking ahead at those. But I tell organizations, they say, I might not have the funding, this is too big of a task. Usually a first incremental step is a contact registry. So what that is basically what Jeff just talked about. Find out who in the world and do think globally, because very much I see, you may be thinking only US, only English speaking, but in the rare disease space, we often find that we need to collectively get enough data aggregately. We need to look globally. So definitely be thinking about a contact registry as kind of a first step into this space.
I love the fact that you referenced globally, Jason, because we've heard it on several of the panels that's already been done today. But when you look at rare diseases, like just by its nature, it's rare, right? So you have to extend your reach as far as possible. And also, while you're doing so, look at other syndromes. Like that's a big kind of hot topic, is like, okay, what are some other syndromes? You know, if we were to approach this rare disease challenge today from day one, and we recognize 7,000 different rare diseases, would we break off at individual organizations and all attack separately? Not a chance, right? We would look for ways to kind of come together, find out where our similarities are, and how can we provide some of those similar phenotypes to researchers so that maybe a hit on one syndrome benefits 5 or 10. Like, that's the dream from our perspective.
I agree. Go ahead, Jason. Go ahead.
I was going to go to a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I was too. I imagine we're probably going to the same topic because there seems to be a couple of themes that are dominating. So I'll let you go.
Well, I was just going to say, I hear this quite often, and was the first question that came in is, what data is needed by pharma and academia? So, again, I go back to start simple, think contact registry, but there's a lot of questions. How do you guys see, like, what's the strategy for what data should I be collecting?
It's a great question. And it varies by disease. And sometimes you want to, like Jeff was saying, find a disease that's similar to yours that has successfully navigated this and get some ideas from them. That's one step. The second step along the way is it might change over time what data you need, right? And I know that sounds horrible, but this is an evolving process, right? So let's say a new phenotype or a new set of symptoms is identified in a group of patients and you don't even know about it at the start of your data collection. You're going to have to addend that. So there's a couple ways you can do those types of changes in real time. And it actually gets to one of the questions another question that's in the chat in terms of what fields are necessary and really how does that work? And whether or not getting patient collected data is enough. And I think that there's different ways you can do this. You can have patient entered registry data, which is sort of one level, and it starts with a contact registry like we were speaking about, and then patient entered data. But then for the next step, a lot of people use clinical records. And so I think that there's different steps that you can take in terms of what data you need to abstract. So for example, I've worked on rare diseases where we started with a patient registry or contact registry, patient registry, but then eventually we moved to a full retrospective natural history study of clinical records. And so once you have those primary source documents, you can go back and ask new questions of the documents you already have if you need it. And so it was a staged approach, and each level got you some information, because as much as you plan ahead, you're not going to have it perfect on that first shot. And that's okay. It really is. It's just a matter of being able to adapt over time, because there's not one clear answer about what you need, in all honesty, for every disease. And like I said, it's going to change over time.
Yeah, Becca, I was going to just add to that, like, don't try to boil the ocean, right? Like, you really need to kind of partition this out. It's like for us and for most organizations, like specifically talking to those of you who are joining us from an organizational, you just don't have the tools under your umbrella necessarily to do all of this. Right? It's very rare that an organization like one of us in a rare disease has someone that's an expert in regulatory issues and governance issues and all the things that come with data collection. So really kind of start small and then build the program, reach out to other organizations and collaborate. We had so much success by just reaching out to 10 or 20 different other organizations and just learning from them. What are you doing? Where did you find success? What were the pitfalls to avoid? Because we have to recognize those things too. That John Wooden said, if we don't have time to do it right the first time, how are we ever going to go and redo it, right? So we don't have time as a patient-led organization to redo things. Everything's about doing things efficiently, and to do that, you have to collaborate. You have to get shared learnings from other organizations.
Do you see? Go ahead, Becca.
Real quick, just to add to that, I agree. I think that structuring it well from the beginning is important, and structuring into that adaptability, and so that you can add things in the future if you want to without necessarily having to redo them. I think that's an important consideration. And the other question that's come up a lot that sort of goes along with this is, and we can get into this maybe in a minute, I don't know, Jason, if you want to comment on that before I do, but is the ownership of the data and how that works, which I think sort of plays along with this whole topic that we're talking about also. But Jason, I cut you off. So.
No. I was going a different direction as well. So yeah, the ownership of the data is highly important. Right. I mean, different people have different philosophies on this topic. So I would definitely say make sure your partners align with where you want to go there, because you may have a vendor or an institution that's not aligned with what that case, because I've seen a lot of organizations that have partnered and been stuck because their data is siloed or stuck within an institution. So I guess that's maybe moving a little bit off of the topic, but ownership, the way I think of it is patient owns the data, and then usually there's an advocacy or some kind of steward that sits on top of that is the steward of that data on behalf of those patients. So I don't know what shareholder or stakeholder that you are within that equation, but that's kind of the lens that I look at it. Jeff, I don't know if you have a difference of opinion there. Or...
No, I think you're spot on. I've heard the word shepherd used. I've heard steward. I kind of view myself as the sled dog, the one out front, just mushing ahead, pulling everything I can and facilitating conversations. This is everything that I focus on is our patients in our world, right? And so I'm always thinking about how to move this needle forward for our patients as efficiently and effectively as possible. it's not everybody's priority. Sometimes researchers get stuck in research, right? And we have to be able to make sure that we have a seat at that table to be able to converse about how to move things forward. We don't want things getting stuck, siloed. You hear about the information being siloed for whatever reasons. There's a variety of reasons. And that doesn't just exist with academic institutions. Sometimes it's within organizations. You have multiple organizations for the same syndrome who aren't working together. Like, collaboration is 100% necessary here.
And that's one of the things that needs to be set up from the beginning. So just like you're talking about what data fields you want to collect, it's really important from the beginning you were clear in your communications with everyone about how you want ownership of that data or stewardship of that data to work, so that you don't end up putting everything in something that becomes siloed, right? Because you really want to be able, ideally, to share that data with multiple investigators down the road who have potential therapies, right? That's the dream, right? You really want to be able to provide that and use that data for a variety of purposes, so you don't have to recollect it, or another group doesn't have to recollect it. So just like you're thinking from day one, what fields do I need? What data do I need to collect? You have to set up an infrastructure and an organization to protect that data and to figure out how you're going to share that and with who, and under what processes.
I would also say your institutional review board is highly important here in how you set up the informed consent. I've also seen a lot of hit the wall because your IRB and your informed consent, only says you can do certain things. And granted, you can actually reconsent people, but I can tell you, people in the community get tired of joining a study, having to consent. So it's easy, as much as you can think of that ahead and have that conversation with your IRB or whoever is going to be managing that part, I think the better off you will be. I also saw even thinking about, I'm going to collect data with this platform, but in the future, I saw claims being talked about in one of the questions. Do you have ability to link, or there's a term now going around, tokenization of data. So can I tie, that patient's claims data or that patient's EHR data? So I would definitely be thinking very broad in how you scope that, so you don't have to go back, 100 times and reconsent that patient.
Another thing that goes into the consent process that was brought up in the chat, and it's a good point, is the differences between the EU and the US data protections. And obviously the EU data protections changed within the past couple of years, and it's been very difficult for people. A lot of reconsentings had to happen and being able to merge those two. So it's tricky, I'm not gonna lie. And we work heavily with the European collaborator, and it takes a lot of sort of going back and forth and making sure you understand the policy and what's accepted and what's not accepted. So thinking about, if you're really going to try for a global approach, understanding how you're going to be able to consent those patients outside of the United States is important.
I think, again, to speak to the point of phasing your rollout, right? You just can't go too big too quickly. For one, I think, Jason, you kind of might have referenced it, is the fatigue that patient and patient families get from filling out these surveys. So, you hear about some folks who are doing such granular studies right off the rip that you have 300 questionnaires, and it's overwhelming, all right? And so then when you go back to them and say, I need you to do it again, there is a seed kind of planted in the back of their mind, like, wow, that was a very cumbersome effort, right? And so don't try to do all languages at one time. Don't try to do all the questions at one time. Start out where you can kind of get people engaged, because that's what you want. You want engagement. You want that equity with your community when you go to them and say, hey, we need you to fill this out, that they're responsive, because you've built that equity, that trust with them, that it's going to lead to something else.
I see Sophia asked a question, and she and I have done a lot of white papers and talks together. But we talk about transparency with the community. So if you do ask a question or need to reconsent or do anything with, the database and the registry that you've built, I would say be transparent with them. Don't try to skirt it or hide it, because there's things that happen. So I would definitely say be transparent. The other piece of that, and we've implemented in our system, is ability to give insights back to patients. So we have real-time feedback. You answer a survey, you can see the population and where that's just the way our system played that out. But I hear a lot from patients and caregivers that feedback is good and keeps them engaged. So I definitely have that as part of your strategy as well.
I see some questions are asking about biobanking or live cell, basically repositories. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And I don't know, Jeff or Jason, if you've interacted or helped groups set this up. Again, you need to have an IRB consent to be able to do those types of process. And you need a organization that can help house that for you. Sometimes that's done within an academic setting. Again, I mean, I'm fully disclosure, obviously I'm in an academic setting. There's limitations to that though, right? In terms of samples and being able to get samples out. I think most investigators work really hard to make that happen. But there's differences, obviously, to each institution. There are also now a movement afoot in terms of trying to have centralized registries or biobanks and repositories available for the rare disease patient communities. And there's a lot of resources that are being developed that have done this, where the biorepository is really in the hands and housed by the foundations, which I've worked with groups to do this. I think that it is good in a lot of ways in that you really have sort of oversight of those samples. And oftentimes you can contract with a group to help you make sure that they're stored properly and cataloged properly and collected properly. But remember that if that is the case, you then have to develop a process by which you're gonna have people apply to be able to access those samples. So you need some sort of oversight group within your foundation or in conjunction with another group to be able to decide how you determine if investigator X, Y, or Z wants those cells, how do you give them to them? So I think there's a couple ways to answer the question about biobanking. I think there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either go with an academic partner or you can go with a non-academic partner. The important things to ask though is, what's the oversight of that and what's the regulatory process in the back end to get the samples out? I don't know if Jason or Jeff wants to add anything to that.
The big piece I've seen there, because we are doing some of that, is linkability. So make sure all your patient reported data and clinician reported data that you may be collecting or other sources that you can link back to that specimen. Because I've seen the case where it goes off and we can't have that longitudinal view. So I'd definitely be asking questions about that.
I agree.
I know there's also been, I see the dollars signs all over the place, commercialization or generating revenue off of your data and how best to do that. My own personal opinion, yes, there are commercial models and totally depends on pipelines and disease areas and all that, but I would not necessarily start with that end in mind, knowing that you could potentially get there. I will say you're much more attractive to, a biotech or pharma if you have data. So don't get me wrong with that statement that I just said, but definitely don't have that be the main purpose of why you're doing this and where you're going.
I think as long as you can access, like through a registry, your patient population where you can be the communicator to them, I don't know that you're trying to monetize the data as an organization, right? What you're trying to do with the data is get it in the hands of researchers who can further study and push projects forward, right? So then you can develop hopefully a therapeutic. And at that point, then your contact registry comes into place that you can go to your community and discuss and make sure that you have the kind of data population where a study could be had in a particular location or locations.
I see a question in here, again, going back to the international question about IRBs that are more experienced with international IRBs. And I know there's a lot of different IRB options, whether, again, it be outside or inside academia. And I think that each one is slightly different in terms of how it works and where your IRB is going to be held. It's really up to the IRB, to the review board. I should say that we have written our IRBs so that we're able to consent international patients. It took a while, but through our institutional IRB, we can do that. And having them all consented under our IRB has made it a little easier. It's tricky because you have to figure out a way to consent patients in China and Germany and all over the place at different hours with different languages. But having them all under one central IRB has been very helpful to us. But I know different groups have tried to do this differently. Again, though, going back to what Jeff was saying, I think this is a later step in the process, right? Because you gotta start somewhere. And I think if you suddenly decide you're gonna try to start and have an international IRB from day one, it makes it really tricky. just because it's sort of like trying to run before you can walk, because you don't even know who those patients are to try to access them at this point, because you don't even have a contact registry for example.
Early on, you just have to keep flexibility, right? You can't get yourself locked into something that doesn't have the flexibility to then grow, because you're going to have to, again, to the point about surveying is going to change over time. You're going to have to be able to pivot and be nimble. Otherwise, if you get bogged down in a system where it's 3 to 6 months to be able to figure something out, that throws everything off track, right? So keeping that flexibility from the start, I think, is the most critical component.
And I guess from my perspective, and Becca, maybe you can comment, patient reported data, we've gone international with, but once you go clinician reported or start getting into other data sources, you really have to work with the local regulatory framework and ethics committees. I haven't had success, but there's probably examples out there of one IRB that kind of rules over all of that.
Right.
You just have to go region by region. So as you start tacking on it, again, go with the build model, right? Start simple, get complex. So some of you guys may be on that more complex leg. There's a lot of work to work all those nuances of all that data collection around the world.
I agree 100%. One way we've had some success with that, in all honesty, is remembering that the patient record is your own proprietary data, right? So the patient, your record is your data. And so by doing records abstractions, that actually works fairly well. It can be tricky and imperfect because it doesn't always capture everything accurately. But having patients provide their medical records under, obviously, an IRB approval is one way that we've been able to get at least physician-reported data in the form of a medical record. And then, like I said, if you have medical records from patients, if that's something of interest, you can always go back to them if you have a new question to ask. So we've been, especially for I work in ultra rare disease spaces where there aren't enough patients in the US to have a meaningful sort of number that's going to give us a large data set. That's been very helpful for us.
Keep the conversation going. We got lots of good questions, so I'm just trying to read through some, get some other themes.
I see a lot of questions in here about specific platforms for patient registries. And I feel like that's a question that is asked a lot. There's a number of options out there. And Jason and Jeff can probably speak more eloquently to this than I can, but I mean, I work with patients that are filling out registry data on so many different platforms in my clinical setting, just helping them understand what's going on. And there's not a great centralized single platform in the US at this point in time, right? There's a lot of options and there's pros and cons to each. So I think from my perspective as the clinician who's helping families in this case, I think speaking with other groups that have similar diseases to what you're interested in is helpful, and see what platforms they've used and liked. But I'll let Jason and Jeff speak a little more to that.
No, I am one of those platforms. So, but I am the humblest guy, and I say we need more technology people out there building systems to do this. So I'm full blown collaborative in this regard. So I know all my competitors that I compete with, but I can tell you there's consultants that specifically, and you can get them very cheaply, that focus in this area and can do like an RFP, state. I've even seen on some of the Google chats that I've been on in the mitochondrial space where there was a post of just a spreadsheet. So the questions to ask of every vendor to keep it consistent. But I agree, there are a lot of options here. I would say there are some that are very expensive. Don't get discouraged in that, because there are, my heart is that my system is very philanthropic. So we flex to meet the needs of the advocacy group from a pricing standpoint. I know others do as well. But I do caveat with the conversation earlier, ask what that gets you. So some systems are free, but free doesn't always mean, no cost or no skin in the game. So know what you're giving away if you facilitate or go with somebody. And there's perfectly good reasons to do that, and good business models for the people that are doing that. So just know what you're getting into when you go down those roads.
Jason, real quick, can I ask a follow-up question to you, Jason, about that? Not to cut you off, Jeff, but Jason, in your experience, having seen a lot of, competitors, I should say, or different products, red flags for a product that would make you think this is not something, or what red flags should someone be looking for if they're looking at some of these different vendors and opportunities?
I mean, to me, it goes back to that. Well, each of the guys that I know, I mean, they're all good folks, and I have actually friendships across. Yeah. So, but each of us do things slightly nuanced. So it all depends on the group and what they want. Red flag for me is that one that I just hit on, is know where your data ownership, know how that's going to be used. If it's free, can I access it? Will I always be able to access it? Those are the things that I like to hammer on, because I'm passionate about that. I'd probably, for me, being a patient myself and where I would want to be, but I totally get where some of those systems might provide some capabilities and visibility to researchers and other folks through those systems. So I don't fault anybody for going down that road, but that's kind of a push button for me.
Yeah, it comes back to what your organization needs. You know, every organization is different, and there's a bunch of these platforms, you know, popping up, which is a little bit concerning from an organization standpoint. Is how do you filter them, right? How do you know what their intentions are? Are their intentions as altruistic as yours, right? And so you just got to spend time in talking to them and talking to the community. The rare disease community is incredibly giving of their time, their energy, and their input, right? So the more you reach out, you can determine that. And so, you know, things that I've heard, you know, if something is free, how are they then running as an organization? Those are questions you need to be very point blank and ask them, right? Because you want to make sure that data isn't kind of held captive in any way, shape, or form, right? It has to be, especially when it's kind of patient and parent provided, that data needs to stay there, right? So that you've got to vet these folks and make sure that it's the right fit, but you need to understand what you're looking for to be able to determine whether it's the right fit or not.
I just saw a good question that comes across that I get asked all the time. It's from Linda, specifically around IRBs and handling informed consent, because some technology vendors will wrap that up into a service that they provide. My platform, we strictly stay from the technology standpoint and say you can pick your IRB. So that is another nuance. That it was a good question, Linda, that I think it's up to your group. If you think you can take that on, I definitely have different IRBs that I work with that I know well that I can refer you to, but that's something I expect the group to kind of handle outside of me. Whereas I know there's other groups that actually roll that up into their services.
Can I ask a question that I'm not sure if I've seen come through, but people might be thinking about? Okay, so let's say you get this started, right? Let's say as a patient advocacy group, you get either a registry, either a contact registry, a natural history registry started. You have an IRB in place. What is your experience, and maybe Jeff, is a question for you, what's your experience in terms of decision-making process about how you share that data and how you make decisions, both for scientific review in terms of who's going to have access to that data, and also from an industry partner, so whether it be academic or industry, what sort of infrastructure should you be thinking about or starting to get in place as a family, as an advocacy group, or as a foundation, to be able to answer some of those questions? Because I think that's a hard one that comes up a lot.
Yeah, I think we've hit on this in several kind of iterations, and every organization's approach is a little bit different, right? So for us, we look to kind of outsource things that we don't know everything about, right? So we're very fortunate to have a lot of skill sets under our umbrella. So once we get the data, and once the data is analyzed, I would put it in front of our SAB team and say, let's help understand what this data is telling us, what questions we're trying to solve. And then once we kind of determine a research plan based upon the data, then we go out and figure out who's going to do the work to help answer those questions.
Yeah, I think that's great. Can you talk a little bit about how one goes about building an SAB for your foundation? Because I think that goes hand in hand with developing these types of registries.
Sure. Yeah. So again, our team is incredibly gifted with ID10. We're a small patient community. We probably have about 1,000 patients worldwide, but we have two parents, one who works as a drug developer and another one who works at Aluminum. And so he's got a background as a PhD in bioinformatics and microbiology. So those two already being under the umbrella, you know that their mission is in alignment with ours, right? So we have these kind of two key figureheads. And then we also have Dr. Kleefstra, who the syndrome's named after, practicing in the Netherlands still. And so we've been able to build this kind of, centralized cohort of invested folks. And then we've started to, through outreach to other organizations, who are the key people working in the space that would be relatable to KS? We didn't want, KS isn't like a very well-researched condition right now, but what are some of the periphery organizations or syndromes, right? And who's doing work in organoids, or who's doing work on ASOs? And I think you got to take a step back organizationally, again, not to kind of beat the same drum, but understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? Are you interested in drug repurposing, small molecule, ASO, gene therapy? What does your condition tell you is available? Because, gene therapy for some of us isn't at the point right now where you need to be kind of investing your energy. So then building your team with expertise in each one of those areas so you can get input from all these different things. And then you huddle up as an organization to determine what is going to be the best fit for you. What is going to get the impact to your community? Because you can have a 10-year plan. Your community wants to know what's 18 to 24 months, right? It's all about urgency. So is there low-hanging fruit out there that you can tackle? Build your team so that you can get those answers from them.
Now that's a hugely important piece that I see. It's well defined within organizations, and they've done a real good job of getting all of that circle of folks that really know, or they're lacking, or they're building, right. So you definitely have to have that team around you. I do see Megan asked a question about real world data. I was head of real world data at IQVIA, so this one kind of hit home. I did talk about claims data earlier, but I go back to what Becca said of use your patients to get as much data as possible. That I know those data feeds can be very steep. I think that was Megan's point. So if you can use your patients to start aggregating some of that data on their own, in the US, there's just been a lot of unlocking of data ability for patients to access. Now, I'll just say the State of the Union, I've been in EHR long, don't think that means it's just all available. So it's not easy, but now patients have access to their EHR records and there should be no blocking. Patients have access to some of this claims data and there should be no blocking. That's US specific rule, but I would say definitely use your patients to try to go fetch that data. It'll be a lot less costly. And some of the things we're doing in our system of how can you incentivize the patients to do that? And if you provide patient tools, and I can provide that EHR data back to them on a friendly basis, not just for you get sucked in and sent to the research database and they never see it. So how can they use it and it be useful to them? It becomes an incentive for them to go collect themselves.
And to go along with that, to get EHR data out, you have to, the physician or whoever puts the EHR data in has to correctly identify the disease and mark it in such a way that you can find it. And so one thing that when I started in this world, I had no idea was as important as I do now. If your disorder doesn't have an ICD-10 code that's unique to your disorder, that's low-hanging fruit that you guys can go after as a foundation to be able to identify patients. So ICD-10 codes are the billing codes we use as physicians to bill whatever diagnosis it is that we're seeing. And the more specific and unique code you can have for your disease, the easier it is to go in those huge data sets and say, okay, show me all the patients that have an ICD-10 code that corresponds to, Kleefstra or whatever disorder it is that you're interested in, and you can accurately find them. Because in the rare disease world, you'll see a lot of codes are mushed together. It's like, other sphingolipidoses or whatever class of disorders it is. So a unique ICD-10 code is really a huge thing that you can do to help be able to pull some of those data sets. And it's something that a lot of advocacy foundations have done. And it's really helped find patients, which is important.
Jeff, do you guys have an ICD-10?
I don't believe we do. I mean, that's a great suggestion just to look into.
I've helped foundations do this. I mean, from a physician perspective, we just have to write letters of support, and then someone goes and sort of argues on behalf of why this disease is important. But it's something that a lot of foundations have done, and it's very doable. So
I was going to say, I've been through the process too. It's tedious, You can do it, but you have to stick with it. And it's not like something you can turn in, in 2 months and have it. So think 12 months slight cycles. But yes, that's awesome, Becca, to bring that up. That's hugely important.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, I stepped on top of you.
No, I was going to say, part of what excited me when it was, offered to come and speak today was this is entirely a learning experience all the time. Like the more engagement you can have from a patient-led organization, like I've told everybody, I relish being the guy in the room that is the least informed, because then I can just soak it up and I can have directions. I can get marching orders. And that's what you have to do, because you can easily kind of look all around you and there's just this kind of like swath of information coming at you. How do you kind of sift through that and be able to find targeted advancements for your organization to just start putting one foot in front of the other and just put yourself in those conversations? Like learning to be comfortable in the uncomfortable by asking questions is going to be what helps drive your organization forward.
See, we got a whole swath of ICD-10 questions. So yeah,
the Office of Rare Disease Research at the NIH has a nice website that talks about what an ICD-10 code is and the process. I know that there was a chance, I don't think we can write in the chat, but we'll figure out a way to get that information out there. But a great resource is the Office of Rare Diseases at the NIH, and they have a lot of information about this. And again, speaking to Jeff, we all learn from each other. I learned this from a different family patient advocacy group. So it was something that they didn't teach us in school. It was something that someone else did. I said, that's a great idea. So
I'd say definitely use your resources too. Like there's other groups that have done it. So use them as another place to learn as well. So go ahead.
I'm going to say one more thing about finding patients, because we've spent a lot of time thinking about it. The other place that is actually really nice to partner with is some of the larger diagnostic labs. So I don't know how many a lot of patients in the rare disease world are now getting diagnosed through exome sequencing or other multi-gene panels. And so some of the larger diagnostic labs, people like GeneDx or Centralized, large labs, oftentimes will, for newly diagnosed patients, sometimes will actually put advocacy or foundation group information in the report. And so working with those diagnostic labs can be really helpful to identify patients.
Thanks, Becca. With that, I'm going to have to close out the discussion for today. This was great. Thanks, Jeff, to you and Becca. I definitely learned a lot and respect you guys. And it's awesome to have a discussion where we all have different viewpoints, but we're all pulling the same direction. That's what I love about the rare disease community overall. So just some closing remarks and a housekeeping before we close out. Thank you so much for the great conversation and insights. Before you head out to the next session, please take a moment to respond to the polls that are now being launched. We all appreciate your feedback on the session and want to ensure that we're able to provide great content and programming for the rare disease community. You can always share your feedback via events@globalgenes.org. Please join us at 3:30 Eastern Time for the office hours and informal networking. Additionally, we encourage you to check out the agenda for the remainder of the event, including the office hours at 3:30, the Cure Accelerator live pitch event at 4:30 Eastern. These are all Eastern time zone. And be sure to take some time to explore the event page, visit the posters, and build your itinerary for the remainder of the week. Please visit the Achievements and Badges tab to learn more about what you could win to pass to future Global Genes program. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.